The bell above the diner door jingled sharply, cutting through the hum of conversation like a sudden alarm. All heads turned as two uniformed police officers strode inside, their presence a stark contrast to the warm, bustling energy of the room. Officer Susan Reed led the way, her piercing blue eyes scanning the diner with the precision of a hawk. Behind her was Officer Laura Hayes, her expression stern and unreadable. They walked with an air of authority that commanded silence, and within moments, the lively chatter of the diner had faded into an uneasy quiet. Marcus Hayes, a young black waiter wiping down a table near the window, froze mid-motion as the officer's eyes landed on him. The cloth in his hand trembled slightly, but his face betrayed no emotion. He had learned long ago how to keep his composure under scrutiny, but something about their demeanor set his nerves on edge. "Hey you," Reed called out, her voice sharp and cutting. She motioned toward Marcus with a flick of her hand. "Come here." The room seemed to hold its breath as Marcus straightened, setting the cloth down. He approached the counter cautiously, his dark eyes meeting Reed's steely gaze. "Yes, ma'am? How can I help you?" Reed's lips curled into a faint smirk. "We've got a report about some cleanliness issues here. Seems like you've been slacking off. Why don't you show us how you clean a table properly?" The comment hung in the air, laced with thinly veiled mockery. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Of course, ma'am. I'll take care of it right away." As Marcus turned to retrieve his cloth, Officer Hayes chimed in, her tone dripping with condescension. "Use your shirt," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "That'll really get the job done." A ripple of shock passed through the room. Murmurs erupted among the patrons, but no one dared to intervene. Marcus froze, his back to the officers, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Slowly, he turned back around, his expression calm but his voice firm. "With all due respect, officers," he said, meeting their eyes directly, "I don't think that's necessary." Reed stepped closer, her smirk turning into a sneer. "You refusing to follow an order?" The tension in the room was electric, the air thick with anticipation. Just as Marcus opened his mouth to respond, the bell above the door jingled again. A man in a sharp tailored suit walked in, his presence like a bolt of lightning. His salt and pepper hair and commanding demeanor silenced the diner even further. "What seems to be the problem here?" the man asked, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. Reed turned, her confidence faltering as she took in the newcomer. "And you are?" The man's sharp gaze shifted to Marcus, and his expression softened. "Victor Hayes, District Attorney. And Marcus here happens to be my son." The room fell into stunned silence. Reed and Hayes exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado evaporating under Victor's piercing gaze. The balance of power shifted in an instant, and everyone in the diner could feel it. Victor stepped closer to Reed, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "I suggest you explain yourselves. Now." The officers stammered, their earlier arrogance replaced by poorly disguised panic. Victor didn't wait for an answer. Turning to Marcus, he placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You all right?" "I'm fine, Dad," Marcus replied, though the relief in his voice was clear. Victor's gaze returned to the officers, his voice cold and unyielding. "You'll be hearing from my office. Get out." Reed and Hayes hesitated for only a moment before making a hasty exit, their retreat marked by the quiet murmurs of the other patrons. As the door swung shut behind them, Victor turned back to Marcus. "You handled that well," he said. Marcus nodded, a faint smile breaking through his composure. "Thanks for stepping in." Victor's hand tightened briefly on Marcus's shoulder, a silent gesture of support. "Always. Let's make sure this doesn't happen again." As the diner slowly returned to its normal rhythm, Marcus felt a renewed sense of resolve. He wasn't just a waiter, he was a fighter, and he wasn't alone in this battle. The night had grown colder as Marcus stepped out of the diner, his breath forming soft clouds in the air. The encounter with officers Reed and Hayes lingered in his mind, a potent mix of anger and humiliation coursing through him. His father's timely arrival had defused the situation, but Marcus knew better than to believe it was truly over. People like Reed and Hayes didn't take kindly to being challenged, and their retreat was more strategic than a sign of defeat. Victor Hayes' sleek black car idled at the curb, its engine a soft purr against the quiet night. The district attorney leaned against the driver's side door, his sharp eyes watching as Marcus approached. The diner's neon sign cast a faint glow over them, painting the scene in muted hues of red and blue. "You okay?" Victor asked, his tone steady but tinged with concern. Marcus nodded, though his expression betrayed his lingering frustration. "Yeah. Just tired of it, you know? They come in here like they own the place, treating people like dirt. And I'm supposed to just take it." Victor placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "You don't have to take it. What happened tonight was unacceptable, and I'll make sure it doesn't go unchecked. But you've got to keep your head. People like them feed off reactions." Marcus exhaled slowly, nodding again. "I know. It's just hard sometimes." Victor's gaze softened. "I get it. More than you know. But you've got a future ahead of you, Marcus. Don't let them derail that." Marcus's lips curved into a faint smile. "Thanks, Dad. For showing up when you did." Victor smiled back, giving Marcus's shoulder a squeeze. "Always." As Victor climbed into his car and drove off, Marcus lingered for a moment, his hands stuffed into his pockets as he watched the taillights disappear into the distance. The street was quiet, save for the faint hum of a distant engine. Shaking off the weight of the evening, Marcus turned and began the short walk to his apartment. The faint sound of footsteps behind him set his nerves on edge. He glanced over his shoulder, his pulse quickening when he saw the familiar silhouettes of officers Reed and Hayes emerging from the shadows. They weren't in uniform now, but their presence was unmistakable. "Out a little late, aren't you, Marcus?" Reed called out, her voice dripping with mockery. Marcus stopped, his body tensing as he turned to face them. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Reed smirked, her hands resting casually on her hips. "Just wanted to have a little chat. Off the record." "Yeah," Hayes added, her tone equally condescending. "You seemed real confident back there in the diner. Thought we'd see if that confidence holds up when Daddy's not around." Marcus's jaw tightened. "If you have something to say, say it. Otherwise, leave me alone." Reed took a step closer, her smirk widening. "Oh, we'll leave you alone. After you understand how things work around here. You might think you're untouchable because of who your father is, but out here? That name doesn't mean as much as you think." Marcus didn't back down, his eyes locked on Reed's. "You done?" For a moment, the tension crackled like electricity in the air. Then, without warning, Hayes lunged forward, shoving Marcus hard enough to make him stumble back. He caught his balance, his fists clenching at his sides as he stared them down. "You think you're tough?" Hayes sneered. "Come on, let's see what you've got." Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm not going to fight you." "Smart choice," Reed said, stepping closer. "But here's the thing, you don't have to fight to lose. One call from us, and your life gets a whole lot harder. Think about that next time you decide to mouth off." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the standoff. All three turned to see an older man in a janitor's uniform coming down the sidewalk, his weathered face marked with concern as he took in the scene. "Everything okay here?" the man asked, his voice steady but wary. Reed's expression darkened. "Mind your own business, old man." Marcus seized the moment. "Actually no, everything's not okay. These two officers are harassing me." The janitor's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer. "Officers, huh? Funny, I don't see any badges." Reed and Hayes exchanged a glance, their bravado faltering slightly. "Come on, let's go," Reed muttered, grabbing Hayes's arm. "This isn't worth it." As they walked away, Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. The janitor turned to him, his expression softening. "You okay, kid?" he asked. Marcus nodded. "Yeah. Thanks for stepping in." The man smiled faintly. "Anytime. Take care of yourself." As Marcus continued home, his thoughts raced. The encounter had left him shaken but resolute. He knew this wasn't the end. Reed and Hayes were dangerous, and their threats weren't empty. But Marcus also knew he wasn't alone. With allies like his father and unexpected support from strangers, he was determined to stand his ground, no matter what came next. The air inside the courtroom was heavy with tension, the kind that made even the slightest shuffle of paper seem deafening. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, his expression calm but his mind racing. To his right sat his father, Victor Hayes, whose presence radiated authority and resolve. This wasn't just a legal battle, It was personal. Across the aisle, Officers Susan Reed and Laura Hayes sat stiffly at the defense table, their lawyer whispering something to them. Their expressions ranged from defiant to nervous, a stark contrast to their earlier bravado. The judge, a stern woman with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, entered the room, and everyone rose. "Be seated," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a gavel. The trial had been expedited due to the severity of the allegations. Victor had ensured the case would be handled swiftly, using every ounce of his influence to see justice served. The charges were clear: harassment, abuse of power, and threatening a civilian. What wasn't clear was how the defense intended to fight back. The prosecutor stood, a young woman named Elena Torres who had quickly gained a reputation for her sharp mind and unyielding determination. She began her opening statement, painting a vivid picture of the abuse Marcus had endured and the broader implications of such behavior from law enforcement officers. "This case is about accountability," she said, her voice steady and deliberate. "It's about ensuring that those who wear the badge understand the weight of their responsibility, not just to the law but to the people they serve." Marcus Hayes was not just a victim of two rogue officers. He represents countless others who face similar treatment but lack the platform to speak out. As Torres spoke, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Her words resonated deeply, not just with him but with the audience seated behind him, a mix of community members, activists, and reporters. The room was packed, a testament to how much this case had struck a nerve. When it was the defense's turn, their lawyer, a man named Gerald Tucker, stood with an air of practiced confidence. He was older, seasoned, and clearly prepared to sow doubt where he could. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," Tucker began, "this case is not as straightforward as my colleague would have you believe. My clients, Officers Reed and Hayes, have dedicated their lives to protecting this community. Mistakes may have been made, but to paint them as malicious perpetrators of abuse is not only unfair but unsupported by evidence." Marcus's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. He could feel Victor's reassuring hand on his shoulder, grounding him. The first witness called to the stand was the janitor who had intervened during the alley confrontation. His testimony was clear and detailed, recounting how he had witnessed the officer's harassment of Marcus. Under cross-examination, Tucker tried to undermine his credibility, questioning his ability to hear and see clearly in the dim light. The janitor held his ground, his quiet determination earning murmurs of approval from the audience. Next, it was Marcus's turn. As he took the stand, he felt the weight of every eye in the room on him. Torres guided him through his testimony, her questions carefully designed to draw out the truth without leaving room for ambiguity. Marcus recounted the events at the diner, the officers' mocking comments, and their later confrontation in the alley. His voice remained steady, though the memories brought a tightness to his chest. "How did you feel during these encounters?" Torres asked gently. Marcus hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I felt humiliated, powerless. They wanted me to feel small, to remind me that they were in control." "And did you ever provoke them in any way?" "No," Marcus said firmly. "All I did was stand up for myself when they tried to humiliate me." When Tucker rose for cross-examination, the atmosphere shifted. His questions were pointed, designed to rattle Marcus and cast doubt on his account. "Mr. Hayes, isn't it true that you have a history of being confrontational with authority figures?" Tucker asked, his tone sharp. "No, that's not true," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. "Really? Because I have records here indicating an incident during your high school years where you were suspended for arguing with a teacher. Would you call that cooperative behavior?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "That was a misunderstanding. I wasn't being confrontational. I was asking questions about a grading decision that seemed unfair." Tucker smirked, clearly pleased with the seed of doubt he had planted. "Interesting. So you have a history of questioning authority when you feel wronged." "I have a history of standing up for myself," Marcus countered, his voice steady. Victor's subtle nod from the table bolstered Marcus's confidence. Tucker continued to press, but Marcus held his ground, refusing to let the lawyer twist his words. As the trial progressed, more witnesses were called, including several diner patrons who had witnessed the initial encounter. Their testimonies painted a consistent picture of the officer's behavior, further solidifying Marcus's account. Reed and Hayes were called to testify as well, their carefully rehearsed statements attempting to justify their actions as a misunderstanding. When Torres cross-examined them, her questions cut through their defenses like a scalpel. She highlighted inconsistencies in their statements and forced them to confront the implications of their actions. "Officer Reed," Torres said, her tone razor-sharp, "you claim that your comments to Mr. Hayes were meant to ensure compliance. Can you explain how asking someone to use their shirt to clean a table aligns with your duties as a law enforcement officer?" Reed faltered, her earlier confidence wavering. It was a poor choice of words. A poor choice of words. Torres repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Or an intentional attempt to degrade and humiliate." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the judge's gavel restoring order. Reed's silence spoke volumes. As the day drew to a close, the closing arguments loomed. Torres's final statement was a powerful plea for accountability, her words resonating deeply with the audience. "This case is not just about Marcus Hayes," she said. "It's about the kind of community we want to build, one where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or the color of their skin. It's about ensuring that those in positions of power are held to the highest standards. Anything less is unacceptable." Tucker's closing argument attempted to reframe the narrative, casting the officers as victims of overzealous scrutiny. But the cracks in their defense were too deep to ignore. The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of their decision evident in their somber expressions as they filed back into the courtroom. The foreperson stood, a folded piece of paper in hand. "On the charges of harassment, abuse of power, and threatening a civilian, we find the defendants guilty." The words hung in the air, a moment of vindication that sent a wave of relief through Marcus. Reed and Hayes sat motionless, their expressions a mix of shock and anger. Victor placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, his pride evident. "You did it," he said quietly. Marcus nodded, a sense of closure washing over him. The battle wasn't just his, it was for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight begin to lift. The courtroom buzzed with activity, the verdict from the previous day still reverberating through the halls of justice. Marcus sat in a quiet corner of the lobby, staring at the rows of people bustling past him. The weight of the guilty verdict against officers Reed and Hayes brought a sense of validation, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. His instincts, honed by years of navigating subtle and overt hostility, told him more trouble was coming. Victor Hayes strode into the lobby, his presence commanding as always. He carried a thick folder under his arm, his expression unreadable. Spotting Marcus, he approached, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. "You ready to go?" Victor asked, placing a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. Marcus nodded, rising to his feet. "Yeah. I just hope this is really over." Victor's face softened. "It's over for now, but we both know people like Reed and Hayes don't give up easily. Stay alert. And remember, you've got people watching your back." As they exited the courthouse, the flash of cameras greeted them. Reporters jostled for position, shouting questions. Victor guided Marcus through the chaos with a firm hand on his shoulder, ignoring the frenzied calls for a statement. "No comment today," Victor said firmly as they reached the safety of his car. "Let's get out of here." The drive back to Marcus's apartment was quiet, the radio playing softly in the background. Marcus stared out the window, his thoughts swirling. He wanted to feel relieved, but an undercurrent of unease tugged at him. Something about the way Reed had glared at him during the trial, cold, calculating, stuck with him. Later that evening, Marcus sat at his small kitchen table, a stack of law school applications spread before him. He tried to focus, but his mind kept wandering. The sound of a car idling outside drew his attention. He moved to the window, peering through the blinds. A black SUV sat parked across the street, its engine running but no one exiting. His pulse quickened. Grabbing his phone, he dialed his father. "Dad, there's an SUV outside my apartment," Marcus said, keeping his voice low. "It's just sitting there." Victor's tone was immediately serious. "Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Marcus hung up and double-checked the locks on his windows and door. The SUV remained stationary, its darkened windows concealing whoever was inside. The minutes dragged by, each one amplifying his anxiety. When Victor arrived, he pulled up directly behind the SUV, cutting off its exit. As he stepped out of his car, the SUV's doors opened, and two men in plain clothes emerged. Their demeanor was casual, but the tension in their movements suggested otherwise. "Gentlemen," Victor said, his voice cool and authoritative. Mind telling me why you're parked outside my son's apartment? The taller of the two men smiled faintly. Just waiting for a friend. No harm done. Your friend lives here. Victor pressed, his sharp gaze unwavering. The man's smile faltered. Look, we're not here to cause trouble. Just move along. Victor stepped closer, his tone hardening. You're not fooling anyone. I suggest you get back in your car and leave. Now. The men exchanged a glance before retreating to the SUV. The engine roared to life, and they drove off, leaving Victor standing in the glow of the streetlights. Upstairs, Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. When Victor joined him, his father's expression was grim. Who were they? Marcus asked. I don't know, Victor admitted. But I'll find out. Until then, stay vigilant. The next morning, Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from a number he didn't recognize. The text read, "You think this is over?" Marcus's chest tightened as he stared at the words. He forwarded the message to Victor, who responded immediately, "I'm coming over." Within an hour, Victor arrived with a colleague, Elena Torres. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, the weight of the situation palpable. "This isn't just intimidation," Elena said, her voice measured. "They're trying to provoke you. If you react, they'll use it against you." "What do we do?" Marcus asked. "We document everything," Victor said. "Every message, every suspicious car, every encounter. We build a case against them. They're hoping you'll slip up, but we'll make sure they're the ones who do." Over the next few days, the harassment escalated. Anonymous calls at odd hours, veiled threats slipped under Marcus's door, and the constant presence of unfamiliar cars in his neighborhood kept him on edge. Each incident was meticulously recorded, a growing pile of evidence that painted a damning picture of Reed and Hayes' vendetta. One evening, as Marcus returned home from a shift at the diner, he found his apartment door slightly ajar. His heart raced as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning for signs of intrusion. Papers from his law school applications were scattered across the floor, and a single note sat on the table, "Stay in your place." Victor arrived minutes later, his fury barely contained. "This has gone too far," he said. "We're taking this to the police chief." The meeting with the chief was tense. Victor laid out the evidence, his voice unwavering as he detailed the harassment. "These officers have crossed every line imaginable," Victor said. "If you don't take action, we will." The chief, a grizzled man with years of experience etched into his face, nodded slowly. "This is serious. I'll open an internal investigation immediately. In the meantime, we'll assign protection for Marcus." Despite the chief's assurances, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was spiraling out of control. The lines between justice and vengeance blurred as Reed and Hayes grew more desperate. But Marcus knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't back down. With his father and a growing network of allies by his side, he was determined to see this fight through to the end. The city was cloaked in the muted colors of dusk as Marcus Hayes pulled his jacket tighter against the evening chill. He'd spent the day trying to focus on work at the diner, but the weight of the escalating threats from officers Reed and Hayes had made it impossible. His father's warning echoed in his mind: "Stay vigilant." It wasn't just advice anymore, it was a survival mantra. As Marcus approached his apartment building, the faint hum of an engine drew his attention. Across the street, a familiar black SUV sat parked under a dim street lamp. He hesitated, his pulse quickening. Were they still watching him, or was this a different vehicle entirely? Shaking off the thought, he walked inside, double-checking that the door locked behind him. His apartment was quiet, almost eerily so. The faint buzz of his refrigerator was the only sound as he dropped his keys on the counter. He noticed a single envelope sitting on his coffee table. It wasn't there when he left. His stomach tightened as he approached it, his eyes scanning the room for signs of disturbance. The envelope was unmarked, the edges slightly crumpled. Marcus opened it cautiously, his hand steady despite the tension in his chest. Inside was a single piece of paper with a chilling message written in bold, blocky letters: "You're playing a dangerous game. Stop now, or you'll regret it." Marcus's grip tightened on the note. This wasn't just intimidation anymore, it was a direct threat. He took a photo of the note and sent it to his father with a brief message: "We need to talk." Within 20 minutes, Victor Hayes arrived, his usual calm replaced by a simmering anger. Behind him was Elena Torres, the prosecutor who had been instrumental in their case against Reed and Hayes. They sat at Marcus's kitchen table, the note between them. "This changes things," Victor said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't just harassment anymore. It's a clear threat."
Elena nodded.
"We need to escalate this to the authorities immediately. This can't be ignored." "And risk them getting more brazen?" Marcus asked, his frustration evident. "What's stopping them from breaking in again or worse?" Victor placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. "We'll make sure it doesn't come to that. But we need to be smart about how we handle this. They want you to react, to make a mistake they can exploit. We won't give them that." The three devised a plan. Marcus would stay with Victor temporarily, while Elena worked with the police to tighten security around them. A private investigator was also brought in to monitor the situation, adding another layer of protection. The next few days passed in a tense blur. Marcus found it difficult to relax, even with the additional security measures. The feeling of being watched never left him. One evening, while reviewing his law school applications at Victor's home, his phone buzzed with an anonymous message. "You're making it worse for yourself. Stop while you can." Victor immediately forwarded the message to Elena, who added it to the growing file of evidence. "They're getting desperate," she said during a late-night call. "Desperation makes people sloppy. We'll find our opening soon." The breakthrough came unexpectedly. The private investigator uncovered a lead. Reed and Hayes had been meeting regularly at a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of town. The investigator's photos showed them entering and leaving the location at odd hours, often accompanied by others who appeared to be civilians rather than law enforcement. It was suspicious enough to warrant closer scrutiny. Victor and Elena worked quickly to obtain a warrant, enlisting the help of trusted allies within the police department. A raid was planned, with Marcus insisting on being present despite his father's protests. The night of the raid was tense. Officers in tactical gear surrounded the warehouse under the cover of darkness, their movements silent and precise. Marcus stayed back with Victor and Elena, watching from a safe distance as the operation unfolded. The first breach was swift, the officers entering through the main doors with practiced efficiency. Shouts and the sound of boots against concrete echoed in the night. Marcus and the others waited in silence, their breath held as they listened to the unfolding chaos. After what felt like an eternity, an officer emerged, signaling the all-clear. Marcus and Victor approached cautiously, their hearts pounding. Inside, the scene was startling. The warehouse was a makeshift command center, complete with whiteboards covered in maps and notes, crates filled with unmarked equipment, and computers displaying surveillance footage of various locations, including Marcus's apartment and the diner. Reed and Hayes were in custody, their expressions a mix of anger and defiance. As Marcus stepped closer, Reed's cold gaze met his. "You think this is a victory?" she sneered. "You have no idea what you've started." Victor stepped between them, his voice firm. "You've lost. It's over." Reed's smirk didn't waver. "We'll see." As evidence was collected and catalogued, it became clear that Reed and Hayes had been running an illicit operation far beyond their harassment of Marcus. The files uncovered connections to other corrupt officers and even local officials, creating a web of corruption that stretched far wider than anyone had anticipated. Back at Victor's home, the weight of the night's events settled over them. Marcus sat on the couch, staring at the photos and documents spread across the coffee table. "This isn't just about me anymore," he said quietly. "This is bigger than I ever imagined." Victor nodded, his expression serious. "And we're going to see it through. All of it." Elena leaned forward, her resolve evident. "We've got what we need to bring them down. But it's going to be a fight. Are you ready for that?" Marcus met her gaze, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I've been ready for a long time." The next phase of the battle had begun, and Marcus knew it would test him in ways he couldn't yet predict. But for the first time in weeks, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope. The early morning air was heavy with anticipation as Marcus Hayes sat in the back seat of Victor's car. The downtown skyline loomed ahead, the courthouse standing tall among the cluster of buildings. Today would mark the next chapter in their battle against corruption, but the stakes felt higher than ever. Marcus's mind raced with questions about the connections uncovered in the raid on the warehouse. The shadowy network Reed and Hayes had been part of seemed deeper and more insidious than anyone had imagined. Victor glanced at his son through the rearview mirror. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. Marcus nodded. I don't think ready is the right word, but I'm here. That has to count for something. Victor gave a small, reassuring smile. It does. Just remember, we're not doing this alone. Elena and the team have our backs. And the evidence we've gathered is damning. As they pulled into the courthouse parking lot, Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from Elena. Conference room, 3rd floor. Don't be late. They walked through the courthouse doors, their steps echoing in the marble halls. Reporters crowded the lobby, their cameras flashing as questions flew. Victor shielded Marcus from the chaos, guiding him through the throng until they reached the relative calm of the elevators. In the conference room, Elena Torres stood before a table strewn with files and photographs. Several other legal and investigative team members were present, their expressions a mix of determination and tension. She gestured for Marcus and Victor to take seats. We've got a lot to cover, Elena began, her tone brisk. The evidence from the warehouse has given us a clearer picture of what we're dealing with, but it's also raised more questions. Reed and Hayes weren't just acting on their own. They were part of a larger operation, one that's been using law enforcement resources for personal gain. She flipped through a stack of photos, spreading them across the table. Images of marked bills, falsified reports, and surveillance equipment painted a damning picture. We've identified at least 4 other officers who were complicit in their schemes, Elena continued. But what's more alarming is the involvement of 2 city officials. This isn't just a police corruption case anymore. It's political. A murmur ran through the room. Marcus leaned forward, his brow furrowing. City officials? Who? Elena hesitated before sliding 2 photographs across the table. One showed a man in a tailored suit, shaking hands with a uniformed officer. The other depicted a woman standing at a podium, her smile tight and practiced. Councilman Eric Maddox and Deputy Mayor Lillian Grant, she said. We've traced financial transactions and communications linking them to Reed and Hayes. They've been using their positions to shield these activities and profit from them. Marcus felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. And they've been getting away with it this whole time. Victor placed a calming hand on his shoulder. Not anymore. We have the truth on our side. But we need to move carefully. The more powerful the players, the more dangerous this becomes.
Elena nodded.
Which is why we're coordinating with federal authorities. This is bigger than anything we've dealt with before, and we need the resources to match it. But Marcus, your role in this is critical. You're the one who started pulling the thread that unraveled this whole operation. Marcus met her gaze, a mix of determination and trepidation in his eyes. What do you need me to do? We'll need you to testify again, Elena said. Not just about your experiences with Reed and Hayes, but about the broader implications. Your testimony will tie the pieces together in a way that's compelling and undeniable. Marcus took a deep breath. Then that's what I'll do. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Marcus spent hours with Elena and her team, going over every detail of his encounters with Reed and Hayes, as well as the events leading up to the raid. Each session was grueling, but Marcus's resolve never wavered. Meanwhile, Victor worked tirelessly to ensure their safety. The threats had not subsided. If anything, they had escalated. Anonymous messages continued to flood Marcus's phone, each one more menacing than the last. Security around them was tightened, and a federal task force began monitoring the movements of everyone connected to the case. On the day of the hearing, the courthouse was a fortress. Federal agents stood guard at every entrance, their presence a stark reminder of the gravity of the situation. Inside, the courtroom was packed, the tension palpable as Marcus took the stand. Elena began her questioning, guiding Marcus through his testimony with precision. He recounted the events at the diner, the alley confrontation, and the relentless harassment that followed. His voice was steady, his words clear and compelling. The room hung on every detail, the weight of his story undeniable. When it was the defense's turn to cross-examine, their approach was aggressive. They tried to paint Marcus as a troublemaker, questioning his motives and credibility. But Marcus held his ground, countering their attacks with calm, measured responses that left little room for doubt. As the hearing continued, the evidence from the warehouse was presented. The photographs, financial records, and surveillance footage painted a damning picture of the corruption that had festered within the city's institutions. The names of the implicated officials sent shockwaves through the courtroom, and the crowd murmured in disbelief as the extent of the conspiracy was revealed. When the hearing adjourned, Marcus stepped outside to a sea of reporters. Cameras flashed as questions flew, but Marcus kept his focus on Victor and Elena, who stood beside him. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that justice might prevail. As they walked to the car, Marcus turned to Victor. "Do you think this will be enough?" Victor met his son's gaze, his expression resolute. "It has to be. And no matter what happens, we'll keep fighting." Marcus nodded, a sense of determination settling over him. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The city's skyline was bathed in the fiery hues of a setting sun, the towering buildings casting long shadows over the streets below. Marcus Hayes stood at the edge of a rooftop parking lot, his phone gripped tightly in his hand. The message he'd received earlier was burned into his mind: "Meet me tonight. Come alone." The address in the text led him here, a desolate and dimly lit parking structure on the outskirts of downtown. He wasn't alone in this fight, but the cryptic warning had left him with little choice but to face it head-on. Victor and Elena had reluctantly agreed to let him go, on the condition that federal agents would be stationed nearby, ready to intervene at the first sign of danger. Marcus's breath misted in the cool evening air as he scanned the rooftop. His footsteps echoed as he moved, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls. A black SUV sat parked near the far edge, its tinted windows reflecting the last light of the day. A figure stepped out, their silhouette sharp against the fading glow. "Marcus Hayes," the voice called out, firm and familiar. As the figure stepped closer, the details became clear. It was Lillian Grant, the deputy mayor, her expression a mix of defiance and calculation. "You're behind all this," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. Grant's lips curved into a faint smile. "Behind it? No, Mr. Hayes. I'm just one piece of a much larger puzzle. But you've become quite the thorn in our side. Your persistence is admirable." Marcus clenched his fists. "You think you can intimidate me? Threaten me? It's over. We have the evidence. The warehouse, the money, the connections, it's all coming down." Grant's smile didn't falter. "You're so sure of yourself. But let me ask you something, Marcus. Do you think justice is that simple? That a few files and some testimonies can bring down decades of carefully cultivated power?" Before Marcus could respond, another voice echoed from behind him. "She's right, you know." He turned sharply to see Eric Maddox, the councilman, emerging from the shadows. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes gleamed with menace. "This isn't a game you can win." Marcus backed up slightly, his gaze darting between the two figures. "You're both going to pay for what you've done. The people won't stand for this." Maddox chuckled, a low, mirthless sound. "The people? They don't care, Marcus. They'll move on to the next scandal, the next distraction. And while they do, we'll rebuild. Stronger, smarter, untouchable." The tension was suffocating as Marcus's mind raced. He reached for his phone, but Grant's sharp voice stopped him. "Ah," she said, her smile vanishing. "You really don't want to do that. We've been watching you, Marcus. Every move, every call, every message. Do you really think we'd let you walk in here without knowing exactly what you plan to do?" Marcus's grip tightened on his phone. "You can watch all you want. It won't change the fact that your time is up." Grant and Maddox exchanged a glance, their confidence unshaken. Maddox stepped closer, his tone low and threatening. "You have no idea what you've stepped into. This isn't just about Reed and Hayes, or even us. This is about control, about maintaining the order that keeps this city running. You're meddling in something far bigger than yourself." Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "Maybe. But someone has to." Before Maddox could respond, a deafening crack split the air. The sound of a gunshot echoed through the parking lot, and chaos erupted. Marcus dropped to the ground instinctively, his heart pounding as he scrambled for cover behind a nearby pillar. Grant and Maddox had also taken cover, their earlier confidence replaced by visible alarm. Federal agents swarmed the rooftop, their weapons drawn as they moved with precision. The SUV's doors burst open, revealing two more individuals armed and ready. It was an ambush, but not the one Marcus had expected. From his vantage point, Marcus could see Victor leading the charge, his face set with determination. Elena was close behind, shouting commands as the agents closed in on Grant and Maddox. The scene was a whirlwind of movement and noise, each second stretching into an eternity. Maddox made a break for the SUV, but an agent tackled him before he could reach it. Grant, meanwhile, attempted to flee toward the stairwell, only to be intercepted by Elena, whose outstretched hand held a badge and a gun. "It's over, Grant," Elena said firmly. "You're done." Grant hesitated, her defiance flickering as she glanced around at the agents closing in. With a resigned sigh, she raised her hands, her expression unreadable. The chaos began to subside as the agents secured the scene. Marcus emerged from his hiding spot, his heart still racing. He approached Victor and Elena, his relief evident. "You cut that pretty close," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Victor placed a hand on his shoulder. "We had to let them think they had the upper hand. It was the only way to draw them out." Elena nodded. "And it worked. We have them, Marcus. All of them." As the agents led Grant and Maddox away in handcuffs, Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The battle had been long and grueling, but this moment felt like a turning point. Justice had been served, and the network of corruption that had plagued the city was finally unraveling. Later that night, as Marcus sat on the steps of Victor's home, staring up at the stars, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in months, he felt like they were on the right path. Victor joined him, handing over a cup of coffee. "You did good today," he said, his voice filled with pride. Marcus took the cup, a faint smile playing on his lips. "We all did. But there's still a lot of work to do." Victor nodded. "And we'll face it together. One step at a time." As the stars shimmered overhead, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready. Together with his father and their allies, he would continue to fight for justice, no matter the cost.